Before dawn, I was already awake as usual. The house was eerily silent, too silent, and as I shifted in bed, I half expected the comforting patter of rain beside me, only to find cold sheets instead. It had been weeks since she'd slept next to me. At first, she'd offered excuses. Too warm, too restless, needing space. But now she didn't even say a word. I sat up slowly, rubbing my face and staring at the empty side of the bed. My wedding ring felt unusually heavy, as if my body sensed a truth my mind refused to acknowledge. I headed downstairs to make coffee. The aroma of the brew soon filled the kitchen, stirring up old memories. Vanessa used to cherish a fresh cup in the morning, yet now she barely even sipped hers. Then I heard footsteps behind me, and for a moment my heart lifted. I thought maybe today would be different. Maybe she'd greet me, maybe even smile. "Morning," I said, but there was no response. She simply walked past me like I wasn't even there. I watched her open the fridge, grab a bottle of water, and then check her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, scrolling and typing as if completely absorbed in another conversation, one that didn't include me. I just waited, hoping for even a single look or word. I tried again, but she only sighed and said, "I have to get ready." That was all. No eye contact, no warmth, no familiar kiss on the cheek like she used to give without thinking. I exhaled slowly, feeling as if I had become a ghost in my own home. What hurt the most was that I had no idea why. I replayed the past few months in my mind, searching for the moment everything changed, but nothing stood out. No big fight, no dramatic incident, just an ever-growing distance. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. That night, I lay in bed alone again, staring at the ceiling as the heaviness in my chest deepened. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice asked, "What if this is really the end?" I used to believe love had its own sound. The comforting tone of Vanessa saying my name, the soft laughter we shared over secret jokes, and the way she would hum along to the radio while cooking dinner. Now, love had turned into silence. Later, I awoke to the faint sound of the shower running, realizing she was up before me. It used to be different. Vanessa always cherished those extra minutes in bed, all bundled up under the covers, playfully complaining about not wanting to face the day. I'd even bring her coffee in bed just to hear her drowsy, "Thank you, babe." But now I wasn't even part of her morning routine. I sat on the edge of the bed, my eyes fixed on the bathroom door, which was ajar just enough for steam to spill out and blur the mirror across from me. I could barely recognize my own reflection, yet I felt completely invisible. When she finally emerged, she didn't spare me a glance. She simply tightened her towel and headed straight for the closet. I offered a cautious morning, testing the waters, but she only muttered something half-heartedly, either a weak greeting or just an exasperated sigh. I probably should have let it go. I should have accepted that this was how things were now, but I couldn't. I followed her into the closet and pleaded, "Vanessa, talk to me." She exhaled sharply, grabbed a blouse off the hanger, and replied, "I don't have time for this." Time for what exactly? A conversation? Just a moment of acknowledgement? I moved closer, softening my tone. I don't understand what's happening between us. Can we please just... Before I could finish, she spun around so abruptly that I nearly stumbled. Then she snapped, "Wendell, I said I don't have time. I have a meeting in an hour." I searched her face, looking for any hint of regret, guilt, or even anger. Instead, she merely looked at me with annoyance, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. I swallowed hard and managed to ask, "Do you even care?" That was when I noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Instead of responding, she returned to the mirror and began buttoning her blouse, leaving me with a deep, twisting ache in my stomach. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't just in my head. Vanessa had already checked out of our marriage, and I was the only one trying to hold everything together. Later that night, she got home late. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone without really reading anything, while my dinner sat untouched before me. I'd set out 2 plates, mine and hers, with hers still covered in foil and untouched. I could hear the front door open and close. Then I heard the unmistakable click of her heels against the floor. She walked in, glanced at me, and then at the plate, as if silently saying, "You didn't even have to wait." That was all. No apology for being late, no explanation about a rough day at work. Just that. I clenched my jaw, thinking you could have at least sent a text. She exhaled deeply as she set her bag down on the counter. I was in the middle of something, but I couldn't help watching her, feeling a fire of hurt ignite inside me. "You're always so busy these days," she remarked with a roll of her eyes. "Wendell, please, not tonight. Not tonight, not ever," I thought as I saw her slip off her shoes and rub her temples, as though my very presence drained her energy. That was when it struck me. She wasn't just indifferent anymore. She actually resented me. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor behind me, my heart pounding as my thoughts fell silent. Leaving my untouched plate on the table, I walked out of the kitchen. That night, I finally realized something was deeply, painfully wrong. For the first time, a nagging question crept in. Was there someone else? The next morning, I woke to the sound of Vanessa in the bathroom, her routine unchanged. I lay there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling before rolling over and glancing at the empty space beside me. The sheets on her side were nearly flawless. She hadn't really slept. I sat up and rubbed my face, still haunted by the night's conversation, if you could even call it that, as its weight pressed relentlessly against me. Vanessa wasn't just ignoring me, she was deliberately drifting away. When the bathroom door opened and she emerged, towel wrapped around her and hair damp, she caught sight of me on the bed but made no acknowledgement. Instead, she headed straight for the closet. I watched, silently hoping she'd say something, anything. But she moved with mechanical precision, pulling out her clothes and dressing as if I were invisible. I had never felt so unseen in my own home. I swung my legs off the bed and stood. "Vanessa," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have a lot to do today." I exhaled sharply, fighting back the rising frustration. "Do you even hear yourself? You're always too busy." Since when did that become an excuse to shut me out completely? Finally, she turned, hands on her hips. "Wendell, I don't have time for this." There it was again, her constant refrain. "I don't have time." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Right, no time for your husband, no time for our marriage. But you always seem to have time for—" I hesitated, my words choking in my throat. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "For what?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "For someone else?" I almost blurted it out. I desperately wanted to know. I wasn't ready to face the truth, so I just shook my head and muttered, "Forget it." Without another word, she turned away and continued getting dressed. And that was the end of our talk. That afternoon, I left work early, without really knowing why. I was driven by a restless feeling, as if something inside me was dragging me toward a truth I wasn't yet prepared to confront. When I got home, Vanessa's car wasn't in the driveway. I wasn't surprised. She'd been coming back later and later, always citing the same reasons: meetings, work, deadlines. I stepped into the house, dropped my keys on the table, and for the first time really looked around. The place was unnervingly tidy, almost as if it had been staged. There were no hints of our lives together anymore. The photos still hung on the wall, but they seemed like relics from a different era. Even the kitchen counter, once cluttered with our everyday mess, was spotless. There wasn't a trace of her morning coffee spills or the hurried breakfast we once shared. It felt like Vanessa had already checked out. I went upstairs and paused in our bedroom doorway. My stomach twisted when I saw the perfectly made bed and the vanity that once held a collection of her perfumes, now reduced to a single bottle, the rest gone. My heart started racing as I approached the closet. At first glance, everything looked normal, but a closer look revealed noticeable gaps. Her side wasn't completely empty, yet it was lighter. Fewer hangers held her clothes than before. Some of her favorite dresses had vanished, and a few pairs of shoes were missing. I knelt down and opened the bottom drawer where she kept her smaller travel bags. It was empty. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my composure, but inside my heart was pounding hard. She was leaving, or worse, she had already left in every meaningful way. I stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the drawer and staring at the void where her things should have been. The realization was sinking in, slow and suffocating. I wasn't just losing my wife, she was disappearing right before my eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open closet, my mind tangled in a mess of unanswered questions. The missing clothes, the empty travel bag. It was all so obvious, yet I couldn't fully comprehend it. How long had she been planning this? How long had I been sleeping beside someone who had already decided to walk away? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't noticed the gaps in her wardrobe or the way our house now felt more like a waiting room than a home. But another part, the part that had been screaming at me for weeks, refused to let it go. Clenching my jaw, I stood up and started searching for answers. I wasn't frantic or panicking. I was methodical. I began checking her drawers, the nightstand, even the bathroom cabinets. My hand trembled as I opened each one, searching desperately for any clue about what was happening. Then, in the top drawer of her dresser, I found it. A small envelope tucked beneath a stack of neatly folded scarves with my name printed on the front. My stomach twisted as I carefully pulled it out, my fingers feeling numb, and I returned to the bed. The envelope wasn't sealed. After a deep, hesitant breath, I slid out the folded paper inside. It wasn't a lengthy explanation at all, just a few lines in Vanessa's crisp, almost detached handwriting. It read, "Wendell, I don't know how to say this, so I won't try. I need space. Please don't make this harder than it already is." I read it over and over, searching for any hidden meaning, but found nothing, no emotion, no regret, just a cold, impersonal request for me to step out of her life quietly. Something inside me broke. Space? She claimed she needed space, yet I'd been giving her all the space in the world these past weeks. I'd tried to understand, giving her room to breathe and work through her thoughts, and now she was telling me to let go, as if our marriage were nothing more than a failing investment. Clutching the letter in my fist, I stormed out of the bedroom. I needed air, so I drove aimlessly, my thoughts a jumbled, overwhelming blur. It all felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life crumble from a distance. Before I knew it, I found myself parked outside a small diner, a place Vanessa and I used to frequent when we were newly married. I wasn't sure why I ended up there, but something pushed me to get out and step inside. The diner was unchanged, dim lighting, worn leather booths, and the lingering scent of coffee and fried food. I slid into a booth by the window and ordered a black coffee without really thinking. My hand still trembled as I placed Vanessa's note on the table. Smoothing out its creases, I stared at that note for what felt like an eternity. Maybe I should have been angry, maybe heartbroken, but more than anything, I just felt utterly exhausted, tired of trying, tired of waiting for an explanation that would never come, tired of fighting for someone who had already walked away. "Rough night?" a voice asked from across the table. I looked up, startled, to see a woman standing there with a coffee cup in hand. She looked like someone my age, dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans. I couldn't help but frown and ask, "Do I know you?" She offered a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry if that's weird," she said. "I just noticed you've been staring at that paper for like 10 minutes, as if it might change if you keep looking." I exhaled slowly and glanced back at Vanessa's note on the table. "Yeah, something like that," I replied. After a brief pause, she gestured toward the empty seat across from me. "Mind if I sit?" For a moment, I nearly said no. I wasn't in the mood for conversation, but something inside me shifted. Maybe it was sheer exhaustion, or maybe it was the fact that, after weeks of feeling invisible, someone was finally paying attention. So I nodded. "Sure." She slid into the booth and set her coffee down. "I'm Miriam, by the way." "Wendell," I answered. She studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the paper. "Want to talk about it?" I let out a slow breath and ran a hand through my hair. "Honestly, I don't even know where to start." She smiled gently. "Well, lucky for you, I'm a pretty good listener." And just like that, I found myself recounting the story of how my wife had faded away from our marriage long before that note even appeared. For the first time in ages, I didn't feel invisible. I'm not sure why I opened up so much. It might have been the exhaustion, or perhaps after being ignored for so long, when someone finally looked at me, really looked, I couldn't hold back. Miriam just sat there, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, listening intently. She didn't interrupt or give me those pitying looks people often use when they don't know what to say. She simply let me talk, and I did. I told her how Vanessa used to be my best friend, how we were inseparable for years, finishing each other's sentences, knowing each other's routines like the back of our hands. I shared memories of road trips, lazy Sundays, and even the silly arguments that always ended in laughter. Then I spoke about the silence and distance that crept in. I described the nights I spent awake, staring at the ceiling, while the woman I loved lay beside me as if she were a million miles away. I even showed her the note. Miriam read it with an unreadable expression, then set it back on the table and tapped her nails lightly against it. "So she just left you with this?" I muttered. "Not officially," I added. "She's still living in the house." She was just going through the motions, but when it came to feelings, she checked out long ago. Miriam sank back in her seat and let out a deep sigh. I just don't understand people like that, I said, raising an eyebrow. People like what? I asked. With a shake of her head, she replied, people who can't just be honest about what they want. If she wanted out, she should have told you straight up instead of dragging you through this endless, awkward breakup. I paused, stunned. Her words hit home exactly. She gave a slow nod. Exactly, it's like she's already on her way out. Instead of grabbing a bag and leaving, she's erasing herself bit by bit, one missing dress, one conversation left hanging at a time. It's as if she wants you to vanish from her life before she's completely gone. Her insight stung harder than I expected because it was exactly what Vanessa had been doing, though I hadn't wanted to face it. I'd been in denial, and Miriam's next words made it all too clear. She sipped her coffee and said, I've seen this before. People rarely leave all at once. They just fade away until there's nothing left. And when they're finally gone, you realize they have taken a part of you with them. I swallowed hard and joked, what are you, a therapist? She smirked and replied, nah, just someone who's been there. I looked closer at her and noticed the weariness in her eyes and the way she stirred her coffee as if lost in thought, evidence of battles she'd fought before. Unable to hold back any longer, I asked, what happened? She glanced at me, then down at her cup, and for a moment I thought she might not say a word. Finally she sighed, my ex-husband, one day he just stopped being there for me. She continued, it's a lot like what you're going through now. You still share a home, still go about your day-to-day, but deep down you feel that he's already left. He just hasn't found the words to say it. I frowned, the truth sinking in further. How did you know for sure? I pressed. She let out a soft, humorless laugh and explained, he began acting as if I wasn't even here, coming home late without any excuse, making plans without me. Eventually he stopped saying goodnight, and that was the one thing that really broke me. You never really notice until it's too late, she added quietly. When someone you've spent years with stops saying goodnight, it feels like a small death every time. I nodded slowly and exhaled, and a heavy, understanding silence settled between us. It wasn't an uneasy silence, but the quiet understanding shared by two people who know exactly what the other is thinking. After a long pause, Miriam tilted her head and asked, so what are you going to do now? I let out a deep sigh and rubbed the back of my neck, unsure how to answer. I honestly don't know, I admitted. I don't want to be the guy fighting for someone who's already checked out, but I can't just let our marriage end without a fight either. Miriam studied me for a few moments before leaning in closer. Wendell, let me ask you something, she said softly. I looked up, waiting for her to continue. If Vanessa left right now, officially and completely, how much of yourself do you think she'd take with one? Her question hung in the air, and for the first time, I found myself at a loss for words. Deep down, I already knew the answer. She'd already taken too much. That night, as I drove home, it felt like I'd abandoned a part of myself back in that diner, a piece left behind in that booth with Miriam. Maybe it was the unvarnished truth she forced me to face, or perhaps it was the collapse of my own self-deception. Either way, I felt both lighter and, paradoxically, heavier. Pulling into the driveway, I saw Vanessa's car parked in its usual spot, the porch light casting long shadows over the yard. For the first time in weeks, I hesitated at the door, unsure if I was bracing for a confrontation, an argument, or some confession. Yet when I stepped inside, the house remained as silent as ever. Upstairs, I could hear the soft rustle of fabric and the gentle creak of drawers opening and closing. I set my keys on the table and made my way up slowly, my pulse steady, but my thoughts all tangled. When I reached the bedroom, I saw Vanessa by the dresser, methodically folding clothes into a suitcase. I froze in the doorway, the sight striking me harder than I'd expected. It seemed as though she hadn't noticed me, or if she had, she simply didn't care. Her actions were deliberate and imprecise, as if this weren't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but something she had been planning for a long time. I exhaled slowly, managing to say, so this is it? For a moment she paused, her fingers clutching the fabric before she slowly turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable, no trace of sadness or regret, just that distant look I'd come to know too well. I was going to tell you, she said quietly. I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. When? After you've already left? I pressed, stepping further into the room and keeping my tone calm but firm. How long have you been planning this? She swallowed hard and glanced down at the suitcase. leaving me with even more unanswered questions. After a moment, a sharp twist of pain hit my chest. "And you never thought I deserved to know?" I asked, but she only exhaled, as if that was all there was to say. "Wendell, I didn't want a big fight. I just didn't want to drag this out," she murmured. Her words made it clear that our marriage had become nothing more than an inconvenience she was eager to end. I clenched my jaw, feeling the weight of her indifference. "Were you ever going to be honest with me?" I pressed. In that split second, I caught a flicker in her eyes, a silent admission that said it all. I exhaled slowly, the truth settling over me. She looked away, lips pressed together in silence. I stepped past her, running a hand through my hair as my head pounded. I had spent weeks, even months, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong, searching for that moment when I lost her. Now, watching her pack a suitcase as if I were just a passing phase, I realized she was ready to leave. That's when it hit me. I hadn't lost her at all. She had let go of me long ago, and I was too blind to see it. For a long, heavy moment, neither of us spoke until she finally sighed. I raised my hand to stop her from saying more. "Don't, whatever you're about to say, just don't." Without another word, her expression remained unreadable. I turned my attention to the dresser, my fingers tracing the worn wood, accepting that there was nothing left worth fighting for. Taking a deep breath, I walked out of the room without looking back. Later, I sat alone in my car with the engine off, the only sound the soft hum of crickets. My mind was awash with memories, echoes of conversations that no longer mattered, and questions without answers. I expected to feel anger, relief, heartbreak, but instead, all I felt was emptiness. I gripped the steering wheel and stared blankly at the dashboard, a part of me already gone. I spent years trying to figure out where things had gone wrong between Vanessa and me, desperately attempting to repair a bond that had been fractured long before I even noticed. Now that she'd finally made her choice and truly left, I was left surrounded by silence and wreckage. Was this really her plan? To erase me so completely that I just sit here, stunned, as she walked away without a second thought? A part of me wanted to turn the car around, demand answers, and force her to face me one last time before she disappeared for good. But I knew better. Some people never leave with a dramatic farewell. They just stop being yours long before they actually walk out the door. Vanessa had been gone for ages. I let out a slow breath, pulled my phone from my pocket, and stared at the screen. There were no missed calls, no texts, nothing from her. And I realize it's time to start over, a life where it's just me and a fresh start.